Welcome to Military Analytics. Soldiers are the most important element in a war. No matter how powerful the armies have, they must have soldiers who are psychologically and physiologically capable of using them. The Russian army made many mistakes in ensuring the psychological and physiological health of its soldiers, especially at the front. Thousands of starving, thirsty, and unable to find clothes, Russian soldiers appeared. This internal crisis in the Russian army is growing. According to Western reports, the Russian army lost more than 220,000 soldiers. However, a very interesting situation, as mentioned in the reports in which it's claimed that more than half of the Russian soldiers were lost due to their poor health and inability to treat the wounded. A deadly epidemic disease has now been added to these stunning situations. Soldiers of the Russian army on the southern fronts are struggling with the epidemic. Now let's examine how the Russian soldiers got a deadly disease on the southern fronts and what happened on the front. The effects of the war in Ukraine continue to oscillate between the eastern and southern axis of the country. Until the spring months, the center of clashes was usually the eastern front lines of Ukraine. But as the weather warmed up, both sides of the war shifted the focus of their attacks towards Ukraine's southern front lines. Russia's main aim in this region was to protect Crimea first and to prevent the Ukrainian advance before it reached the peninsula. The primary goal of the Ukrainian armed forces on the southern front lines was to completely clear the Russians from Kherson and to liberate the Crimean Peninsula. Again, with drone and missile attacks. With the increase in temperature, the Ukrainians began to make the Russians feel much more that they would realize these basic goals. Missiles and gunfire began to reverberate on Ukraine's southern front lines after giving a great shock to the Russian supply lines. The Ukrainians started to focus on the front lines in the southern region again and tried to bring the supply crisis to the contact line where clashes were most common. The Russians tried to respond to this situation by establishing more fortifications, but the Russian troops contracted a deadly disease as they dug up and where animals that died of the epidemic were buried, and all these Russian troops were out of combat. Yes, you heard right. For the first time since the beginning of the war, Russian troops faced such a critical situation, one of the worst days for Russian leader Vladimir Putin's army. This disease started in Astaranga. Let's go to Nestyarenka, where this incredible event took place. And let's take a look at the before and after the situation here and the causes of the disease. With Ukraine's focus on the southern front lines, the main focus of the clashes was the Russian positions in Nazarenko. If you remember, in the past few weeks, Ukrainians have made remarkable progress around this village, and the Ukrainian forces had weakened the Russian defense there. The main target of the Ukrainian 44 Artillery Brigade was a Russian tank responsible for fortifying a position in the tree belt near Nazarenko. This is not the only position fortified with tanks. In fact, it is quite common practice to fortify open spaces with tanks. But this tactic has both advantages and disadvantages. On the one hand, when you're making a ground attack, it's next to impossible to break through a tank-fortified position because the buried tank protecting this position can quite effectively protect the open land leading to the position. On the other hand, tank emplacements such as fixed fortifications are often easy targets for artillery. UAV operators of the Ukrainian forces have also spotted Russian army trucks with a Russian armored personnel carrier next to them, hidden in the tree belt at Nestyarenka. These vehicles were most likely used to transport supply, according to Ukrainian soldiers. They are in constant combat with the mortars of the Russian forces in this region. It didn't take long for the Ukrainians to detect the mortars of the Russian forces in Nazarenko and the ammunition depot on the field. The Ukrainians destroyed 3 tanks, 4 trucks, and armored personnel carrier, and an equipment warehouse in Nazarenko with a coordinated work of UAV and artillery teams. This stunning offensive operation was a huge hit for such a small part of the front line. This indicated that the Ukrainians could soon attempt to expand the bridgeheads here. For this reason, the Russians began to strengthen their defenses by digging new trenches in Nazarenka. But it turned out that one of the areas where the Russians were trying to dig trenches and create a new line of defense was an area where epidemic-stricken farm animals were buried, the Ukrainian mayor of Melitopol reported. As Russian forces build new strongholds, they have contracted anthrax, a deadly disease that requires immediate treatment. Anthrax is a bacterium that can kill people if not treated promptly. As the Russians realized this too late, The entire platoon was quarantined while those showing clear symptoms were sent to Russia. The equipment of the Russians in this area remained untouched, and the special defense area here became a quarantine zone. With the emergence of the disease, the defense areas of the Russians in this region were completely empty because the quarantined Russian soldiers are counting the days to recover rather than fighting or defending. If this Russian contingent infects others with anthrax, such as Russian soldiers or commanders delivering supply, the effects could be enormous. On the other hand, the disease does not need to infect everyone to cause problems. Measures taken to prevent the spread of the disease could weaken the Russian defense because the transportation lines will be restricted. Much less supply may come to the Russian troops in this region. More importantly, it could completely upset the Russian army's preparedness and logistics network in the face of the Ukrainian offensive. Already, the Ukrainian armed forces had put serious pressure on the logistics centers of the Russians. Most recently this week, the Ukrainians had begun to weaken the Russian defenses by disrupting Russian logistics. As a result of the point shooting carried out by the Ukrainian forces for this purpose, the Russians lost 10 oil reserves in Sevastopol, 3 oil tankers in Nizhny Novgorod, and many soldiers and equipment due to precision strikes. The most recent reports of the war showed that both sides were trying to weaken the other side before the main battle began. During this weakening attempt, another critical news came from the southern regions of Ukraine. In response to the attacks of the Ukrainian forces, the Russians carried out a massive missile attack on the southern front lines of Ukraine. A spokesperson for the Ukrainian Air Force announced that the Russians began to use a new tactic to open the Ukrainian air defense. In fact, the Russians had previously sent several waves of UAVs before the missiles and programmed these missiles to change their course while in flight. Thus, the Russian forces were trying to confuse the Ukrainian air defense operators. Fortunately, the Ukrainians have adapted to this situation and have reduced the potential for unexpected maneuvers to zero. For this reason, the Russians had to find a new tactic. Caliber missiles are more accurate than Kh-101 missiles. For this reason, the Russians began to use their missiles with less accuracy to spend the ammunition of the Ukrainian air defense systems, and the Russian forces thus paved the way for the Caliber missiles. After such an attack on Ukraine's southern front lines, Russian forces succeeded in destroying what appeared to be a huge ammunition depot in Pavlograd. Pavlograd is one of the main logistics centers in eastern Ukraine, and the airspace above this city is well protected. Still, the Russians managed to fool the Ukrainian air defense operators with their new tactics, forcing them to focus on the wrong targets. Thanks to this, at least one of the Russian missiles managed to break through the defense and hit its target. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian forces finally started to focus on the front line after attacking the Russian analog centers and indirectly weakening the Russian defensive line. As a result, the Ukrainian army began to directly damage the Russian defense line. In fact, the Ukrainian forces seem to have taken control of the southern front lines. Russia's record losses and Putin's inability to find military resources for his army were among the reasons that undermined the advance of the Russian troops on the southern front lines. As we mentioned to you in the video, we may witness a decrease in the offensive operations of the Russian forces in the coming days with the addition of anthrax and epidemic disease to this plight of the Russian army. The Russians may even become incapable of defending against Ukraine because of this disease and lack of resources. At this point, the duty of the Ukrainian army is to make the finishing strike in this critical time period when the Russian troops set a strategy of inaction. The war on the front is very heated, and all elements of the Russian army are paying the penalty for Vladimir Putin's inhumane policies. The Russian army launched a series of inhumane attacks on Ukrainian cities before and on New Year's Eve. However, the Ukrainian army was not weak enough for the Russians to intimidate, and responded by crushing the Russian army completely at the front. The nominal results of the great Ukrainian counteroffensive have thrown all elements of the Russian army into a great hell. While Putin tried to sacrifice more people and fuel the war at every step, not only Russians and Ukrainians, but also Chechens got their share of this ambition of Putin. It is stated in the reports that the Russian army lost more than 110,000 soldiers in the Ukrainian war. In addition, considering the numbers of wounded Russian soldiers, the losses of the Russian army have exceeded 300,000. Even though these losses are tried to be resolved with the mobilization announced by Putin. Reports published from regions where the conflict is intense underline that Russia's casualties are increasing day by day. In this regard, Kadyrov and Prigozhin have been the undisputed biggest supporters of Putin since the first day of the war. While the Russian army was losing soldiers, Wagner, a mercenary group, directed its mercenaries to the region. At the same time, after the failure of the siege of Kiev by the Russian army, Kadyrov appealed to his people and shouted that they should fight for Russia. However, when we look at those days, Kadyrov's move did not go beyond dragging his own citizens to death. We know that after most Chechen warriors went to Ukraine, they joined the Ukrainian armed forces in battalions. There were the battalions of Sheikh Mansur and Dudayev, and now they are part of the armed forces of Ukraine. The battalions of the three warlords at the head of Chechnya, Sheikh Mansur Dudayev and Akhmat Special Forces brigades were the largest forces fighting against the Russians during the war with Russia. With the Akhmat Brigade's betrayal of the Chechens, Vladimir Putin took control of Chechnya and took Kadyrov with him. With the start of the Ukrainian war, Dudayev and Sheikh Mansur troops all joined the ranks of Ukraine, achieving great success against both the Russians and Kadyrov soldiers. And they took the Ukrainian army to the next level. On the other hand, in the later stages of the war, Kadyrov's Chechens who fought on the Russian side set up their camps in the Kherson region. However, Chechens, who were one of the leading units in the Kherson raid and chose to fight alongside the Ukrainian armed forces, drove the Kadyrovites in the Kherson region into Melitopol and Zaporizhia. In recent days, Chechen headquarters have begun to be destroyed one by the Ukrainian armed forces. In the latest report, the Ukrainian General Staff reported that the Ukrainian armed forces hit the headquarters of the Russian invaders near Tokmak in the Zaporizhia region, and a total of 80 Chechen fighters were destroyed. This attack is similar to the attack carried out in Tokmak a few days ago. A few days ago, the Chechen camp of the Russian occupation forces was blown up by the Ukrainian HIMARS in the outer region of Tokmak in the Zaporizhia region. Also on New Year's Eve, the Great Russian Fortress was destroyed in the Makiivka region of eastern Ukraine. It was stated that after the attack on the headquarters, there was a loss of 400 soldiers. A group of Kadyrov soldiers is believed to have been at the scene during the attack, even though the Russian Defense Ministry said in a statement that the loss was 89. The report from the Ukrainian armed forces said something different. It is stated that after these attacks carried out one after another by the Ukrainian armed forces, the loss of Chechens has increased considerably. Recently, the leader of Chechnya, Kadyrov, made a similar statement and admitted that the Chechen casualties in Ukraine had reached very serious levels. The Russian army suffers heavy losses not only in Zaporizhia, but also in many regions by being exposed to base attacks. In this way, however, the Russian Ministry of Defense has excuses in this regard. The Russian information space continues to cover the official responses to the HIMARS attack by Ukraine on a Russian base in Makiivka to criticize endemic problems in the Russian military apparatus. The Russian Ministry of Defense issued an official response to the strike on January 4th, attributing it to the presence of mobile phones within range of enemy weapons systems and their mass use by personnel in violation of prohibitions. The Russian Ministry of Defense also claimed that the death toll in the attack was 89, including the deputy regimental commander, Lieutenant Colonel Baturin. The open attempt by the Russian Ministry of Defense to load the strike on individually mobilized soldiers, as the Russian Ministry of Defense predicted most likely to do on January 2nd, immediately aroused the anger of Russian citizens. One citizen stressed that it was extremely wrong to blame mobile phones for strikes and concluded that it was the commander's negligence that was to blame, not the mobile phones and their owners. War commentators, on the other hand, noted that the use of mobile phones on the front lines in the 21st century is inevitable and efforts to prevent their use are futile. Russian citizens. Criticism of the Russian Ministry of Defense focused largely on the incompetence of the Russian military command. Many claimed that the Russian military leadership did not understand the basic facts that Russian soldiers were facing at the front and tried to shift the blame to their command. Much harsher statements came from Ukraine, the chief of the main military intelligence directorate of Ukraine, and that the Ukrainian army is planning a major offensive in the spring that will liberate the lands from the Crimea to the Donbass and inflict final defeats on the Russian Federation. Ukrainian officials had previously stated that Ukrainian forces would try to maintain the initiative through a series of ongoing and subsequent counterattack operations in the winter of 2023. With Ukraine's ongoing counterattack operations this winter, as Ukrainian forces can use their continued and subsequent counterattack operations this winter to set the terms for a larger counterattack operation in the spring. There was no indication that Ukrainian forces intended to halt counterattack operations this winter in order to launch a major counterattack this spring. Budanov noted that there will be more deep attacks inside Russia, but declined to comment on Ukraine's involvement in previous attacks on Russia's rear. But we know that the Ukrainian armed forces have been hanging behind the front recently and have carried out serious attacks with partisans within the Russian borders. This gives Putin a brand new bitter prescription in the midst of this harsh turmoil. Kadyrov's criticisms of Russia's military commanders continue. Kadyrov blames the Russian generals directly for the losses. However, we can observe that the Chechen fighters do not work very well with the Russian frontline soldiers. Russian President Vladimir Putin's rhetoric about Russia's escalating war against Ukraine includes a tried and tested tactic to provoke the Ukrainian people with long historical roots. As with Putin's crusade to annex Ukraine in 1944, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin accused the entire Chechen population of collaborating with Nazi Germany. Chechen soldiers fighting on behalf of the Soviet Union's Red Army were stripped of their prizes and declared traitors in a move that the European Parliament would later classify as genocide. Stalin expelled 1 million Chechens from their homeland. Chechen warriors have not forgotten these days, and they do not want the Ukrainians to suffer a similar fate. Most experienced Chechen warriors are fighting alongside Ukraine and praying for Ukraine to win because when this war is over, they will be able to ignite a new freedom war in their own land, and the Russian army will have no answer to give them. Kadyrov began to have a say in the administration of Chechnya in 2004, and Kadyrov, who later came to power, approached Putin with absolute loyalty. According to most Chechen citizens, Kadyrov was a traitor out of respect for Putin. But all Putin's wishes came true in this geography. He now had a country leader under his command, and since then there has been no problem in Chechnya. However, we now know that the situation has changed, and the Chechen people are waiting for an opportunity for a new uprising against the Russian leader. We can say that it will not be very possible for Kadyrov to stop the Chechens this time. Russian forces noticed that Ukrainians were methodically accumulating forces in and around Fulachar and in anticipation of an offensive operation, started bombing and attacking the whole region. However, Ukrainians managed to regain the upper hand, launched their attacks along the whole contact line, and were already recorded operating on the other side of the river. Last time I told you that Russians finished a 1-month-long process of forces accumulation, launched a renewed offensive operation, and managed to increase the area of control around Volodar. I also told you that due to the unexpected weather changes, Russians temporarily lost control over the situation, and Ukrainians successfully exploited the window of opportunity by pushing the Russians halfway back from the north and assaulting Pavlivka. The freshest reports indicate that maintaining the upper hand was not easy, and due to the intense fights, the initiative went back and forth. At first, Ukrainians tried to develop their success and leverage the newly taken positions for further advancement. But the moment the weather improved, Russians unleashed their aviation to restore control over the situation by any means. The aviation dropped several air bombs on the buildings located in the northern part of Volodar because this is where Ukrainians received their supplies. Some bombs missed their targets and fell near the hangars, but some of them did destroy several buildings. There are no signs of secondary detonations or big fires because most of the equipment and ammunition is likely stored in the coal mines less than 2 kilometers north of Volodar. However, when Russia started taking down high-rise buildings, the situation worsened. Drone footage showed how Russians demolished 2 out of 3 sections of a building. In another video, Ukrainian fighter confirmed that there were soldiers in this building. Ukrainian forces responded to this developments by reinforcing air defense in the southern part of the Donetsk region and even conducting their own airstrikes. After both parties started shooting down each other's jets, both cooled down and for the most part, switched back to artillery. This gave an opportunity to the Ukrainians to replenish their reserves and start preparing for the continuation of their operation. Russian sources reported that Ukrainians reinforced the region with grenade machine guns, self-propelled mortar systems, and a lot of unmanned aerial vehicles and drones. Russian intelligence also claimed that they recorded the relocation of at least 2 battalions to Volodar and at least 1 unspecified detachment. Russians decided not to wait and attack the Ukrainians first. The first Russian group advanced towards the eastern hamlet, while the second group attempted to expand their control over the 3 lines in front of the coal mines by pushing. Russians did achieve some limited success, as drone footage indicated that Russians established positions in the hamlet. But as Russian sources were reported, due to the heavy fire, it was extremely difficult to move forward. Instead of recapturing positions north of Mikulski for the second time, Ukrainians decided to develop their success around Pavlivka. A fighter from the 72nd Mechanized Brigade made a video showing the newly retaken positions and a damaged enemy tank. A drone operator from the same brigade also released the video showing how they are moving further and conducting artillery preparation on the next Russian positions. Russian sources confirmed that Ukrainians conducted an artillery preparation and are preparing to conduct a bigger assault. Ukrainians attacked Russian positions along the entire contact line several hours later. Russian sources already reported that some positions were lost. Soon, Russians resorted to the heaviest artillery in aviation, which forced Ukrainians to stop. But judging by the reported areas of Russian fire, it turned out that Ukrainians were present west of Pavlivka and likely attempted to storm it. It is yet unclear whether this unit crossed the river or attacked Russians from Pradijna. However, this raised panic in the Russian media space, and some started talking about the inevitable fall of Pavlivka. Ukrainian fighters from the 72nd Mechanized Brigade showed how they destroyed 1 tank near Pavlivka, 1 tank near Mikulski, 1 vehicle near Yurivka, and even 1 tulip ant 10 kilometers behind the front line. Ukrainians have also recently destroyed a huge ammunition depot in Baraki. Ukrainians said that they noticed a while ago how Russians were accumulating green boxes in the hangars. So when the appropriate moment came, they struck the depot. The explosions were reportedly heard and seen from 10 kilometers away. Hopefully the preparation for the storming operation will be completed soon, as a successful operation of Russian defense in this region will create a huge problem to Russian forces along the whole Zaporizhia line, and may even mark the beginning of the active stage of the counteroffensive operation.